thank you all for coming out. We have it's an open lecture, but we have two classes in particular. We have the Global Russia class taught by Professor Newcity, Professor Andrews, and we have Econ 490/690, Economic History of the Soviet Union and Post-Soviet Union. We're both delighted to have with us Ambassador Jack Matlock, who is Duke's now long-standing distinguished alumnus in residence. Ambassador Matlock was the last ambassador from the United States to the Soviet Union and was basically advisor to President Reagan, President Bush during a pivotal time. He knows all the major players on both sides from that era. Before that, he was ambassador to Czechoslovakia. He served in the State Department and in the diplomatic corps since, I believe, about 1960. He has his PhD from Columbia University. He's been on the faculty at Columbia, Dartmouth before coming here. He's written a huge number of books, is fluent in a large number of languages. I'm sort of awed by this because his French accent is really good. And he has African languages too, and like this Renaissance man par excellence. Both he and his wife, Rebecca, who's been keeping him on the straight and narrow for decades, are Duke alumni, and so it's just a real privilege, more than anything, to have Ambassador Matlock here with us. Today he'll be talking on the end of the Cold War and the beginning of another. It's just, anyhow, wonderful to have you, Jack. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, and it's really nice to be able to meet with you and talk about these issues because, you know, I think one of the most important issues we face now as a nation is that we seem to be back into the sort of confrontation with Russia to a lesser degree, but also with China, with Iran, in ways that seem extraordinarily dangerous to me. Now, you know, after graduating from Duke back in 1950, long before any of you were born, I spent 35 years in the American Foreign Service. And 11 of those years I spent at our embassy in Moscow, 4 different tours. And quite a few of the other years I spent dealing with American relations with the Soviet Union in Washington, and specifically advising President Reagan as a member of the National Security Council staff responsible for Europe and the Soviet Union, advising on ways that we might negotiate to end the very dangerous Cold War. What disturbs me now is we ended the Cold War, but now we're back in a relationship that seems almost identical to that with the Cold War, but without any of the basic reasons that caused the Cold War. The Cold War was basically about ideology, the conflict of two different systems of government. The Soviet system was one of a Communist Party dictatorship, and one where, well, the Communist Party ran everything, and the Communist Party was structured so that it was governed entirely top-down. Whereas we represented what we called free societies, democratic societies, capitalism, rather than a state monopoly socialism. And this was a very fundamental split because under Marxist-Leninist ideology, the history was moved by the struggle of classes, and that at the point that Marx was predicting that the working class, the proletariat, would take over from the bourgeois class, that is those that actually own the means of production, and would create a classless communist society. Well, it never quite worked out that way in the Soviet Union, but that was the ideology. And therefore, the Cold War was one about basically different ideologies. The current relations with Russia and the tension, which seems to have much of the rhetoric of the Cold War, is not about that at all. It seems to be about whether the United States is the world's rule maker and rule enforcer, and others need to fall in line. In other words, we seem to be competing over who controls what territory. What disturbs me is that is precisely the philosophy that led us into 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century, nearly destroyed Europe and actually much of the rest of the world. And one would have thought we would learn a lesson, but we haven't. And what I want to talk about here is my perceptions of why we haven't. Now, if I could have another slide. The Cold War ended, as I'll point out, around 1987. The Soviet Union broke up in 91. By 1992, Europe was unified. We had no significant armed conflicts elsewhere. It seems that we were entering a new world, a peaceful world, and yet we have this new Cold War today. Now, obviously these things are caused by more than one cause. But one of the most basic causes of our, I would say, mistakenly moving into a second Cold War is our failure to understand how we ended the first one. How many of you have heard we won the Cold War? Probably everybody. You know, when you say we won, you imply somebody else lost. We ended the Cold War by negotiation in the interest of both countries. And some would say, well, now wait a minute. The Soviet Union collapsed. We didn't we win? You're mixing up more than one thing. The point is the Cold War ended well before the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I want to go through some of these reasons because one of the things that has set us up for our problems today is our misunderstanding of them. And we can have the next one. As I said, we ended the Cold War by negotiation. And in the interest of both sides. There were no losers. And you can say, well, we both won. Yes, if we had actually fought a real war, we wouldn't be here today. In fact, one wonders if humanity itself could have survived a nuclear conflict between us, because during the nuclear arms race, at its height, there were more than 60,000 nuclear weapons. Most of them on station, could be authorized and fired within minutes. That was enough. Well, some people said, if they're all used, it will destroy the world 7 times over. Others said, no, 20 times over. You said, wait a minute. Why do you want to do it even once? And what are you doing with all of these? Well, the thing is, We weren't getting them in order to use them. You couldn't use them without having retribution on yourself. And yet you thought, well, if the other side has a few more than we do, they may think they'll have an advantage, so we better get more than they do. And we got into that insane arms race. So it was negotiations that brought an end to the Cold War, not anything like a military victory. That's the first thing I wanted to get across. Now, the second thing is, if we had insisted that the Soviet Union change its internal government before we could end the Cold War, we would still have the Cold War going on. We would still have the Soviet Union. It was not the Cold War or the end of the Cold War that brought about the end of the Soviet Union. Too many people thinking back say, well, the Cold War must have ended when the Soviet Union collapsed. And that, again, is a misperception. There was a multi-part series shown on CNN about the Cold War. And the whole last section was on the breakup of the Soviet Union, and it ends with the Russian flag replacing the red flag of the Soviet Union in the Kremlin. And I was shown an advance copy of that by the producers, and I said, oh, wait a minute. The Cold War had been over 3 years before that happened. How can you make that the end of the Cold War? He said, yeah, but that's dramatic. I said, okay, is this drama or is it history? You're creating drama and you're implying something which is a historical untruth. Now, you know, looking back at those last years of the 1980s and the first 1990s, 3 very, very important things happened in world politics. They were so important, I call them geoseismic, geopolitically seismic. You know, in geology, we have the drift of continents, continental drift. But in this case, the geopolitics of the world was changed. The first of these was the end of the Cold War. I think that ended by 1989, actually end of 88, 89. You can put various dates on it, but as a diplomat, working with the Soviet diplomats from sometime around 1988 and 89, we were working off the same, you might say, the same score, the same book, trying to solve the problems that the Cold War had created in the interest of both countries. So the Cold War ended. The Cold War ended because there was cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union, specifically between Presidents Reagan and the first President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union. It took them both to end it, and it was their cooperation that ended it. Then the second thing that happened, and it wouldn't have happened if the Cold War hadn't ended, was that the Communist Party lost control of the Soviet Union. Not because we demanded it, not because we pressed them, but because Gorbachev knew they needed to reform, and once the Cold War was over, he could try to begin the reforms. You know, I wrote a book a few years ago called Reagan and Gorbachev, How the Cold War Ended. And I interviewed Gorbachev several times for that. I had known him as ambassador, got to know him very well. I dealt with him quite a bit, often one-on-one. And when I told him that I would be writing the book about the two of them, he said, that's good, you knew us both. I'm glad you're doing it. And I said, well, let me tell you what my conclusions are. I don't know whether you would agree. And I said, first of all, that you and Reagan cooperated to end the Cold War, and neither of you could have done it alone. And he said, you're right. But I said, the second one is, the end of communist rule in the Soviet Union, you did that. And Reagan or Bush had nothing to do with it. He said, I remember he reached out, grabbed me on the shoulder and said, "Yes, Jack, and you know what?" And I said, "I think I do. You were the only person who could have done it. Because as the head of the Communist Party," now get this, the head of the Communist Party at that time took the Communist Party out of control of the country. Something most people would have said was a total impossibility. And Gorbachev added when he said yes, he said, "You know," something that we knew at the time, this was a country that really couldn't be changed bottom up. It had to be changed top down. And by God, I did it. So why did he do it? Because he was trying to reform the Soviet Union. He suddenly realized they were not getting anywhere, they were not fulfilling the needs, and once the pressures of the Cold War were off, these military pressures, he began to try to bring in more democratic procedures. And when he started the real reforms around 1986, 87, he began to get pushback from the Communist Party apparatus. And he suddenly realized that he was not going to get these reforms unless he took the Communist Party out of total control of the country, which he did step by step. So the second thing, the communists lost control of the Soviet Union, and then because of internal pressures in a country which had always been ruled by the top, from the top, it was the Soviet Union shattered into 15 independent states. Now, who was responsible for that? Actually, this happened entirely because of internal pressure. People who think, oh, this was the result of our Cold War victory are absolutely wrong. Actually, President Bush, the elder, did his best to help Gorbachev try to establish a more democratic union, which fell apart. We were not pushing at all, we Americans and the government, to break up the Soviet Union. We didn't want that to happen. So the idea that somehow the Soviet breakup was a victory for the West in the Cold War gets it absolutely backwards. Maybe next slide. Now, I've just summarized what I just said, but just to reiterate, Cold War ended cooperation between our leaders. Communist Party lost control of the Soviet Union because of Gorbachev's reforms, not because of anything demanded by the West, and the Soviet Union broke up despite the wish of both sides to preserve a union in a more democratic way. Now, what I wanted to look at, because it's relevant today, was to how we went about negotiating the end of the Cold War. First of all, when I was brought to the White House and the National Security Council, almost kicking and screaming because I was very happy as ambassador in Czechoslovakia. We had a wonderful residence in Prague. Although the politics then were difficult with the Czechoslovak government, we liked it very much there. I speak Czech. We had a lot of friends. I didn't particularly want to go back to Washington and work in the bureaucracy. But I was brought back in the spring of '83 with instructions that the president had decided it was time to negotiate with the Soviet Union, but they had nobody with experience there to plan how to do it. And I was given that plan. Already when I got there, Secretary of State George Shultz had testified to Congress, and he had said that we would be dealing with the Soviet Union on the basis of three principles. Now, this sounds simplistic and so on, but let's think about it. First was realism. And what did he mean by realism? He meant we're going to deal with the Soviet Union considering the reality of what we see, not some theory. At that time, the theorists were saying the Soviet Union cannot be changed. And as a matter of fact, the Soviet Union, you can't deal with them. They're communists. We have to bring pressure on them until they fail and collapse, and then you can try to. In other words, the idea that that you achieve your aims by changing the government. Realism told us, no, that's not going to. Pressure is not going to solve our problems. With anything, it will make the totalitarianism stronger. Realism, not theory, not idealism. Strength. Okay, strength was not in order to force them to do things. We didn't have that much strength. But strength meant that you could negotiate with confidence, and when you needed compromises, that you would have something to compromise with. In other words, if you're going to get into a high-stakes poker game, you want plenty of chips on the table. Because strength is not necessarily, it's strength to persuade, strength. And finally, dialogue. We're going to keep in touch. We are going to negotiate. None of this, refusing to talk, refusing to meet. Okay, this was fine for how to proceed, but I was sort of given the task, okay, this is the way we're going to proceed, but now, what are we going to try to get? What is the substance of this? This took the form, first of all, within the Reagan administration, there were very strong opinions that the president should not meet the Soviet leaders, that we had to just simply bring pressure to bear on them. Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, didn't want any negotiations because he said it would make it harder for him to get his defense appropriations. And yet one of the first meetings I attended with Reagan, very small meeting, just 7 people, held secretly, not even in the West Wing, but in the living quarters, where Reagan expressed, I think it is time for me to meet the Soviet leaders. And his words, I have to show them that I'm not the sort who would eat his grandchildren. And when Weinberger, the defense secretary, said, well, we must be cautious, I don't think you should be meeting, he looked right at him and he said, Cap, we're not going that route. So, nevertheless, he didn't fire these on them. We needed to manage it. And Secretary of State Schultz set up several, again, unannounced meetings for breakfast Saturday mornings, where just the top 2 people of the various agencies, the vice president and the head of the CIA, defense secretary, Secretary of State, and had made a sort of an informal group to discuss our policy toward the Soviet Union. Schultz made me executive secretary of that particular group. And in a bureaucracy, if you're the one that keeps the records and you're the one that writes them up, this gives you, I would say, an incredible amount of bureaucratic power, as long as your superiors agree. And so we came up in there with what we were going to try to achieve and also what we were not going to try to achieve. And this was put in a speech that finally Reagan delivered in January 1984. And this is a full year before Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union. So what we wanted, we grouped in 4 categories. Reduce arms as much as possible, particularly nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. End conflict in third countries. We were both, they would sometimes back one side, we would back the other, and we proposed, let's try to end those conflicts. And in fact, we had Reagan actually make a speech at the UN saying, we don't blame the Soviet Union for these conflicts. We know there are local causes. But what happens is they arm one side and then we arm the other side. We've got to try to help the people make peace and then cooperate and help them build up. And then let's have better respect for human rights. And finally, the fourth one, we wanted to say you got to bring down the Iron Curtain. But you know, if you want to persuade somebody to do something, you don't use pejorative terms. And I thought, how do we phrase this? How do we make it so it's not pejorative? So I came up with the phrase to improve the working relationship. And then we defined it as by getting more contacts and more access to the media, more educational exchanges, sports events, and so on. And that was put in the speech. Now, at the same time, while trying to put the substance out there, we changed the tone of how we went about it. Actually, none of our policies changed. We grouped them that way, but we put them all in terms of let us cooperate to reach a common end. It's not you must do this or you must stop doing that. We must cooperate. And I know in his speech, in January '84 speech, a scholar has actually written a book about it, and she pointed out that Reagan used the word cooperate, I think something like 33 times. Well, I didn't actually count them at the time, but the whole point we wanted to get across is, look, we have got to have a spirit of cooperation. We can't just keep each side demanding what the other side has to do and trying to put the other side at a disadvantage rhetorically. First was to cooperate. Second, to offer reciprocity, to make it. Third was, instead of constantly announcing new proposals, which both sides had been doing, largely for propagandistic reasons, let's start consulting them privately in advance. Let's say, you know, these are things we'd like to do. Tell us if some of them are not possible. Maybe you've got some ideas. We'd like to hear them. And do that before you put together a proposal that you are going to. The other thing is try to understand the limits of the power of the person you're dealing with. One of the things, you know, President Reagan was not a great intellect, and a lot of things he didn't know, he hadn't learned. He was comfortable with that and perfectly willing, in fact eager, to learn more. And therefore he knew how to use his staff. One of the things he did understand, however, is how to deal with another human being. That is, you deal with respect. And if you want something out of them, you don't call them names in public and you don't go hammering at them in public. You treat them with respect. And when he met the Soviet leaders, even the foreign minister, Gromyko, first came to the White House, his first words were always, we hold the peace of the world in our hands. We must be responsible. And he also understood that Gorbachev was not an absolute dictator, that you couldn't push him into an agreement that would look as if they had lost. Finally, not finally, but one of the things that we will stay in touch, we're going to communicate, we don't walk away from negotiating tables. Now, at the same time, I worked out some things that were not on our agenda. I drafted this as a directive, actually classified directive to our bureaucracy, and Reagan approved it. We are not going to challenge the legitimacy of the Soviet system. You know, many of the Reagan supporters, and many of them were on the political right in the United States, were saying, you know, the Soviet Union is basically, it's a result of revolution, the government is illegitimate, We can't deal with them as equals. We shouldn't deal with them as equals. All you can do is just keep pushing at them and trying to push them until they collapse. Well, that we were not going to do. We were not going to challenge legitimacy. We were not going to go for military superiority. We knew that that couldn't be accepted, and if somehow we achieved it, it would not be stable. It made no sense in a nuclear age, because the fact is, it would be insane for us to go to war with the Soviet Union, another nuclear power. Then also, we were not going to try to force the collapse of the Soviet system. Now, Reagan did not like communism. He had, much of his life, he had campaigned against communism. At one point, he had referred to the Soviet Union as an evil empire. But that didn't mean he was trying to bring them down. His perception, which was the same as mine, was it's a lousy system, and if that's what they want, that's their business. What we object to is them trying to impose it on others. We want them to stop that. But as far, if they think they can make it work, that's up to them. So the idea was not that we were going to somehow dictate the way they would change there. Now, before he first met Gorbachev, and that didn't occur until November in 1985, more than a year after he gave that speech and put forward the framework of a negotiating agenda. He wrote on several pages of a legal pad in his own handwriting his thoughts about how to deal with Gorbachev. His secretary typed that up, he made a few changes on it, and it was handed to me when we got on the plane to go to Geneva, saying, well, you'll have a chance to brief the president. When we get there, if he's got something wrong, explain it to him. It's a very interesting document because he's in a nutshell and in very simple language, he explained some very important things about dealing with people. First of all, he recognized that Gorbachev was going to be a tough negotiator, and also that he was not a dictator, that he was going to have to go home and justify anything he agreed to the Politburo. That one of the most important things we had to do was to restore a degree of trust. The lack of trust meant that we weren't getting anywhere with the Soviet Union. He also said human rights were one of our prime issues. He said on that we're much too upfront about human rights. We can hammer at them publicly and we'll get cheers from our bleachers, but it will not help those affected. In fact, it could hurt them. We need to deal with human rights privately. It's one thing to bear in mind. And by the way, this worked within a few years. Then he did say that he's going to make clear to Gorbachev that we don't want an arms race. But if they insist on one, they're going to lose it. This was, in effect, negotiating for strength. And then almost the final sentence, next to the last sentence in that memo was, whatever we achieve, we must not call it victory. Whatever we achieve, we must not call it victory, because that will simply make the next achievement more difficult, if not impossible. Ronald Reagan never said we won the Cold War. He wrote in his memoirs that after his last meeting with Gorbachev, when he was still president, we parted as partners in making a better world. Now, Gorbachev's response, and I'm going to have to run through this very, very quickly. Maybe we can post these and you can use them for your notes. Well, first Gorbachev did agree to meet in Geneva, and they agreed at that time on a very extensive cultural exchange program. cultural exchanges had been totally ended during the Carter administration because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So we had to start them from scratch. But before that, they had not allowed any exchanges of young people. The education exchanges were all on the graduate level. We got them to agree to undergraduate and even high school exchanges involving homestays. That was one of the things, and vastly expanded cultural, athletic, other things, more access to the media on both sides. That agreement was important. But there was also an important agreement in principle. Both of them agreed to the following statement: a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and that means there can be no war between us. And then, you know, on our negotiations, as we proceeded, the negotiations, again, took place so that all of these issues we approached as if we are trying to cooperate to reach a goal that is in the interest of both countries. And when George Shultz started to talk privately, in this case, to the new foreign minister, Shevardnadze, about human rights, he would give him a list of people who either were political prisoners or were refusing their right to immigrate. And Shevardnadze took it and said, well, okay, can we also talk about the position of blacks and women in the United States? And Schultz said, well, yes, of course. I think we're making progress, but we've got a ways to go, and we can use all the help we can get. It wasn't, you got to do this, we're perfect. When you look at some of our human rights things today, we're doing it the opposite way. By the time they met in October '86 in Reykjavik, Gorbachev, a few months before that, had proposed that we abolish nuclear weapons by the end of the 20th century, that is, by the year 2000. And Reagan was very much taken by that. And frankly, they came very close to such an agreement at Reykjavik. But in the final analysis, it broke down because Reagan felt that Gorbachev was trying to prevent us from developing a defense, what he called a strategic defense initiative. This broke down. Still, by 1987, the next year, in effect, Gorbachev accepted the agenda we had set forth a few years earlier. You know, many years later, after the Cold War was over, I asked my friend, the Soviet colleague, Alexander Besmirtnik, who had been the final foreign minister in the Soviet Union, had been ambassador to the United States at times. He worked with us a lot. I asked him, Sasha, tell me, did you guys understand you were operating off our agenda? He said, well, Jack, of course. No professional could miss that. And I said, how the hell do we get by with it? He said, you didn't call it your agenda. You called it our agenda. You know, it's amazing how these little things count. But, you know, when you think about your own life and so on, it makes perfect sense. It's one thing to beat up on the other guy and say, you got to do this, you got to do that. Even if it's something they ought to do, you're probably going to get pushback. On the other hand, if you say, look, these are goals out there, goals that nobody can really quibble with, let's cooperate to try to reach them. All the difference in the world. Now, I'm going to go very quickly through these, but by the time Reagan went to Moscow in May 1988, he was asked on Red Square. He went there with Gorbachev, and one of the reporters called out, "Is this still an evil empire?" He had called it several years earlier an evil empire, and everybody would keep repeating that even when he didn't. But Reagan said, no, that was another time, another era. And then they asked him, well, who's responsible? He said, well, Mr. Gorbachev, of course. He's the leader of this country. He didn't say, well, you know, we set up an agenda and no. And you know, I was in Moscow then, and you know, the word that, first of all, many Soviet citizens respected the fact that he had called them an evil empire. They knew about Stalin, they knew all the things that happened. Finally, it was a foreign leader who was frank about it. But then here's Ronald Reagan, who called them an evil empire, saying, it isn't an evil empire anymore. Gorbachev has changed that. It was one of the most powerful endorsements Gorbachev could have had. By December '88, Gorbachev gave a speech at the United Nations, which in effect, he officially discarded Marxism-Leninism as the basic philosophy of the Soviet Union. He said that Soviet foreign policy would be based on the common interests of mankind and an attempt to create our common European home. That is, to bring down the walls and the divisions. That was profound because under Marxism-Leninism, there were no common interests of mankind. Mankind was driven by the conflict of class interests, and it was the class struggle that was justified. By the way, when people talk about Western values and Eastern values, I remind them, Marxism was a Western philosophy. Nazism is a Western philosophy. All these various philosophies have come out of Western Europe. So the idea that somehow we in the West are democratic and others have gone autocratic ways, there has been just as much autocracy, totalitarianism in Western countries, and based upon Western philosophy as other things. So we need to be careful about these words. Anyway, I date the end of the Cold War philosophically to that speech, because the leader of the Soviet Union had discarded the basic philosophy that had supported the Cold War. Just quickly, let's go through. The Berlin Wall then came down. When I say Reagan demanded it, but Bush enabled it, I'm trying to make this point because, you know, my grandson was going to high school in Princeton. I think we must have been around 9th grade. And I was looking at his American history book. Almost the only thing that American history book had about President Reagan was he demanded that they tear down the Berlin Wall, and they tore it down. Well, yes, Reagan had made a speech there at the wall saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And that was just before Gorbachev came to the United States to sign an important arms reduction treaty. It was important politically for him to let his supporters know he hadn't forgotten that there was still a Berlin Wall, that Europe was still on. But later, the wall was later brought down not by Gorbachev, but by the Germans, when Gorbachev insisted that the East German government start reforms. And President Bush at that time was planning a trip to Europe. And I think Gorbachev, who was then bringing pressure on his East European allies to do more reforms, was afraid he was going to make another tear down the wall speech. So he and his wife asked Rebecca and me to come to see them at the end of a concert. Before it broke up, he took me aside and said, "Would you please ask your president to be a little more considerate?" Well, the word in Russian was more attentive, but probably considerate would be the best translation in English. And I said, well, sure, but could you be more specific? He said, no, just that. So I sent Bush a telegram repeating this and said, you know, he wouldn't explain, but he knows you're going to Eastern Europe. He doesn't want a tear down that wall speech. That will really make it harder for him to press the East European communist governments to reform. And Bush went first to Warsaw, then to Budapest, didn't say a word about the Berlin Wall, but praised perestroika and what Gorbachev was doing to liberate things internally. And by the end of that year, the Berlin Wall was down, brought down by the Germans. So I said, you know, it's not the rhetoric that necessarily brings things down. And you need to understand that sometimes trying to take credit for rhetoric leads you astray as to what the actual causes were. Berlin Wall came down, then finally Bush met with Gorbachev in Malta in December '89, important meeting. They said they did not consider each other enemies. Gorbachev promised not to intervene in Eastern Europe, and the United States, according to Bush, would not take advantage of the changes there. This meeting occurred just a few weeks after the Berlin Wall came down. Then the next year, we got East and West Germany united with approval by the Soviet Union that Germany could stay in NATO. For a long time, Gorbachev insisted that if Germany unites, it has to leave NATO, the military alliance. And in February, Secretary of State Baker was trying to persuade him that it was really in their interest for a united Germany to stay in NATO and have its military embedded in NATO rather than independent. And he started by saying, assuming there is no expansion of NATO to the east, not 1 inch, wouldn't it be better to have united Germany in NATO? And Gorbachev's answer was, of course, any expansion of NATO to the east is unacceptable, but I understand your argument. I recall that as we went back to the embassy from that meeting, I told Baker he's going to approve it eventually. It's a political problem for him, but he's going to approve it. But we still go back to that. It was not exactly a promise, it was not a legal commitment, but in negotiating the unification of Germany, because there was no legal requirement that the Soviet Union had to move its troops out of East Germany. It still had the rights as a victor in World War II, unless these were given up voluntarily. Now, I'm just going to go very quickly through these. I'm now going, the second geopolitical transformation was the communists losing control of the USSR. Step by step, and those steps are there, the Communist Party was taken out of control more and more. You had elections for the first time, you had the rise of Boris Yeltsin in the politics of the Russian Federation. Then when the Communist Party no longer totally controlled the Soviet Union and Gorbachev refused to use force, that is the army or the KGB, to keep the country together, you had the Soviet Union breaking up in December '91. Again, let's go on past that if you want to read this later. In 1992, Europe was free and undivided. The end of communism brought an almost total economic collapse to Russia and to most of the states that came out of the Soviet Union. Despite Reagan's admonition before he met Gorbachev the first time, the U.S. started claiming victory. When President Bush, the first President Bush, was running for re-election, and he began to run behind in the polls, he started saying, "We won the Cold War." This is something, by the way, that Gorbachev has never forgiven him for. He still was saying, "How could George do this to me?" Because Gorbachev knows very well everything he agreed to was also in the interest of the Soviet Union. Then it was the U.S. at this point that set out to take the world over. Now, I think the spirit, and this is the spirit that frankly underlines our policy today, and when you begin to look at it, it is hard to believe that anyone with a knowledge of history, a knowledge of reality, could have taken this seriously. Just think of that. What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. History being defined as a search for the ideal way for people to live. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Wow! Did the process I've just described in some detail imply that? Boy, it never crossed my mind at the time. Now, one of the things that strikes me is how similar our current policies, which are based upon that, I would say, not more, that fanciful, not just dubious, but totally fanciful conclusion. How much it's similar to what we used to call the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Brezhnev Doctrine was that, based upon Marxist-Leninism, that history was driven by the class struggle, that the proletarian class was going to eliminate the bourgeois class and create socialism, which would develop into communism. And that once the socialism was created, it was the duty of the Soviet Union to defend it from internal and external threats. That was the excuse for invading Hungary. That was the excuse for invading Czechoslovakia. That was the excuse for putting pressure to bear on Poland and others. Now, what happened when, after we started saying we won the Cold War, and this proves that our liberal democracy is suitable for all mankind? Well, the conclusion is we not only have the ability to change the world, but it's our duty to spread democracy and maintain a liberal world order. Now, also, we talked to how there had been two superpowers, U.S., Soviet Union. Now there's only one. Oh, wait a minute. What do you mean by superpower? You're powerful, yes, you can destroy the world, if that's what you want to do. Why anybody would want to do it is another question. But what else? What else can you do with military power? Well, you can defend yourself, yes. But can you create a just society? Can you create democracy for somebody? Can you protect human rights by killing people? I mean, and I'll tell you, the idea that when there were two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union ran the world, just ain't true. There were all sorts of things we would have solved if we could have. We weren't running the world then, the two of us, and we haven't been able to since then. But we heard this very often. I'm going to go very quickly through these next slides, but the Clinton administration had some real achievements, but basically, let's see, they missed opportunities at that time to form a post-Cold War order in Europe. Arms reduction stalled. There was no Middle East peace, even though the Oslo agreement seemed to open the door to it. But there were two, I would say, very serious mistakes that Clinton made. One was to begin to expand NATO to the east, in effect violating the pledge, informal as it was, but still a pledge that the Bush administration had made, even though the Soviet Union didn't exist now. Russia had only half the people and was in total disarray, was not threatening anybody, and you start using this Cold War alliance, moving it to the east in the area where there had been part of the Soviet security structure. Then the second thing that happened was the United States, without the approval of the United Nations, made war against Serbia, even though Serbia had not attacked the United States or any of its allies. That was an illegal war, and one in which we said we had to do it for humanitarian reasons, but that was something. Those two acts began to change, the Russian attitude toward the United States. Now, if Clinton missed opportunities, Bush began to destroy them. Although by this time Vladimir Putin had been elected, first appointed acting president and then elected president of Russia. And at first he was trying to cooperate with the United States. When Al-Qaeda attacked at 9/11, Putin was the first foreign leader to call President Bush and offer his assistance, and he gave a lot of assistance as we went into Afghanistan. But then we continued expanding NATO. We walked away from some very basic treaties, such as the ABM Treaty, and it had been the basis of much of our arms control. This was also when we turned the budgetary surplus into a debt. We attacked Iraq, again, without UN approval, which had not attacked us. Clearly an illegal act on our part, even though not only Russia, but also our allies, Germany and France, very much opposed this. Then, of course, we had the real estate and financial near collapse starting in 2007, 2008. And by the time Bush was in, the United States was the world's largest debtor. By 2006, the majority of people in many countries considered the United States the greatest threat to the peace. Quite a reversal from attitudes during the Cold War. We'll continue on from this one. Did I have another slide? Yeah. Finally, by the 2007, Putin sort of had enough, and he made a speech in Munich saying, look, we tried to be a partner, and these are the things you have done that we find offensive. And, you know, for a couple of years I was teaching a course on U.S.-Russian relations, and one of the questions I would assign to the students is, would you read his speech and his complaints, and which of these complaints, in your judgment, were valid? In other words, were these just made up things, or were they valid? I think almost every one of the students wrote that, yes, he had a reason for every one of the complaints. These were things the U.S. didn't have to do, but were extremely offensive as far as the Russians were concerned. So when Obama was elected, we had great hopes. And he started strong, and particularly it was very important that he began to restore much more respect in the world. One of the first things that happened very early in his presidency was a Nobel Peace Prize. Many later thought it may have been premature, but it certainly changed the attitude. But as regard to Russia, there was an attempt to put things in state. But when Secretary of State Clinton went to Moscow, they tried something that was supposed to indicate a change in our policy to appeal to the Russians, but it was flawed in a very basic way, and in a sense revealed, I would say, the superficiality of much of the advice that President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton were getting in how to deal with Russia. She brought I think a badge with, in Latin letters, not Cyrillic, the word perigruska, thinking it meant reset. We had said, we want to reset our relations with Russia. Well, are you going to impress them with your knowledge of Russian if you can't put it in Cyrillic letters? The Cyrillic letters are there, but it turns out this didn't mean reset, it meant overload. The word for reset is перезагрузка, and it's spelled in Cyrillic there. So, you know, you come in the first time, you know, she met a Secretary of State with what I would say with a boo-boo and say, well, you know, that's trivial. It's not so trivial. If you're trying to show respect for the other side, do you write their language in your alphabet rather than theirs? And then do you use the wrong word? What does that tell them about the competence of the people who are advising you? And in this case, maybe it was a Freudian slip because the policy did contain a real overload. Well, we were going to cooperate when our interests coincided, but actively support democratic forces and what we call Western values within Russia. In other words, get deeply involved in their internal politics. And you deny Russia any influence abroad. Well, we got a nuclear arms agreement, but then many other problems remained. Now, the Russian view of U.S. policy, I've listed them here, but the basic things is that they see that we are trying to achieve a world domination, calling it leadership, being a euphemism, that we use our democratization program to unseat governments we don't like, that our response to the Arab Spring was that we actually supported removal of governments that created more terrorism. And I've listed other things down, but the last one is important, that they began to see more and more that what we were trying to do was simply to humiliate them and to encourage regime change in Russia itself. And then I would say the increasing amount of public criticism that particularly President Obama in his second administration, I just had trouble understanding. He would make statements like, Russia doesn't make anything anybody wants. First of all, it's literally untrue. They sure made anti-aircraft that we didn't want the Iranians and others to buy. They had the only lift to take people to the International Space Station. They have a cyber warfare capability that certainly will match ours. They have as many nuclear weapons as we do and probably greater lift capacity. What in the world are you to gain by, things like that? Now, again, let's go back. With changes what you can, what we have is really very much like the Brezhnev Doctrine. The Soviet Union, it got itself overextended trying to spread and defend its system, which their philosophy said was suitable for all mankind. We're doing the same. As if democracy and market capital is the future of mankind, it's our duty to spread them. Obviously, you're going to get pushback, and you're going to get pushback from Russia, you're going to get pushback from China, and you're going to get pushback from Iran and probably India and others if we continue this. Now, I think what we need to understand, and what we apparently don't, is that our policy is not serving the national interest now. We seem to be trapped in never-ending wars. We're politically split at home. We're tied to allies whose interests are not the same as ours. We're estranged from potential partners. And our current policy threatens a new nuclear arms race. Now, in sum, I've tried to explain how a misunderstanding of how we ended the Cold War and also how one negotiates has led us to this problem. And let's move on. Now, the Russians also has made mistakes. And when I said in that title, how we ended a Cold War and started another one, I don't mean just we Americans, but we American and Soviet leaders, we American and Russian leaders today. Russia has also made a number of mistakes, many of them simply an overreaction to things that the United States has done. And so they are also in a position that many problems have been created. Let's move on ahead quickly through these. And I wanted to list a few mistaken ideas. You can read those later if you want. But basically, I think the idea that control of land and people equals strength is absolutely wrong. Nothing weakens a country more than to try to rule people that don't want to be ruled. Let's move to the next slide. What really worries me is a recent statement by our new Assistant Secretary of State for European Russia. This is the beginning of his testimony just a couple of weeks ago to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The starting point of our national security strategy is the recognition that America has entered a period of big power competition. We're entering a period like Europe was in 1914, like Europe was in 1938. Give me a break. This is very, very worrisome, Doctor. And I've listed some things here. I won't dwell on them now, but so often we make mistakes, and first of all, in generalizing a very complex thing, putting a label on it and then forgetting the details that really make the difference. We use metaphors, some of which don't fit. The whole idea that we have to resist other countries because we didn't resist Hitler in 1938. I mean, these are just metaphors that don't fit and have gotten us into a lot of trouble. But basically, one of the things that particularly our international theorists forget is that governments are run by people. And ultimately, the interaction of states is not that of billiard balls striking each other on, but the interaction of human beings. And the individual human being psychology plays a great role. I have quoted here, first, let's just go through them. You can change first Fulbright, and let's change it, Eisenhower, and finally John Quincy Adams. If you want to look at these slides, you can read those quotes. But what I'm trying to say is what we're doing today is totally contrary to much of the, I would say, the American tradition. And in particular, I was struck by John Quincy Adams' speech on the 4th of July, 1821, where he says America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher of freedom and independence of all, but the vindicator only on her own. And then he goes on to say, if she well knows that by once enlisting under other banners than her own, were they even the banners of foreign independence, she would involve herself beyond the power of extrication in all the wars of interest and intrigue, of individual avarice, envy, and ambition, which assume the colors and usurp the standard of freedom. Was he talking about Ukraine or Syria, or maybe some of the others that we're involved in? It's your fits. And finally, to go into all of the hysteria about Russian interference in our elections, I think one basic thing we need to remember: Donald Trump was elected by Americans, not by anybody else, and only Americans can solve the problems that he is presenting us. Vladimir Putin was elected by Russians, and only Russians can solve their problems. And frankly, I don't see that there is any reason whatsoever for either of us to try to make these tasks more difficult for the other. Thanks very much, and pardon me for going on so long.